Johnny Carson revealed the 9 Golden Age guests he cherished most. For 3 decades, Carson welcomed America into his late-night living room, guiding The Tonight Show through over 22,000 interviews, everyone from wide-eyed newcomers to Hollywood royalty. But behind the polished charm of television's most trusted host, there was a private shortlist, a handful of rare guests who didn't just entertain the audience but reached Johnny himself. Johnny was the ultimate professional, recalled a longtime Tonight Show producer who spent 15 years at his side. But with certain guests, he forgot the cameras were even there. He wasn't hosting anymore. He was simply enjoying the moment. These were the nights when the laughter was real, when Johnny's guard dropped, and when television history felt like friendship caught on film. And at the very top of that list stood one guest in particular, the man who earned Carson's deepest admiration, and the unforgettable moment that proved just how genuine their bond truly was. James Stewart. James Stewart, the man who made Carson cry. When Jimmy Stewart walked onto The Tonight Show, something extraordinary happened. Johnny Carson, the unshakable king of late-night television, suddenly looked less like the unflappable host and more like a grateful fan in the presence of true Hollywood royalty. Jimmy was everything America wanted to believe about itself, Carson once confided to a close friend. Decent, humble, authentic, the real deal in an industry overflowing with pretenders. Stewart's visits quickly became annual traditions, cherished by audiences and by Carson himself. Unlike so many aging stars who polished their anecdotes into rehearsed routines, Stewart carried with him a quiet honesty. His hesitations, his pauses, even his stumbles for the right word, Carson admired it all. Johnny respected that Jimmy never tried to be slick, a former producer explained. He wasn't performing a version of Jimmy Stewart. He was just being himself. But nothing defined Stewart's place as Carson's favorite guest more than his unforgettable 1981 appearance. That night, Stewart read a poem about the loss of his beloved golden retriever. The verses were simple, tender, devastatingly sincere. And on live television, Johnny Carson, famous for his emotional restraint, broke. A camera operator later recalled, "I'd never seen Johnny react like that. He didn't hide it, he didn't joke it away. He let himself feel it, right there with Jimmy, and with all of us." From that night on, Stewart was more than just a guest. He was sacred ground. Carson's team knew whenever Jimmy was booked, their boss would be in his warmest, most generous mood. Johnny would even ask us to stretch Jimmy's segments, one producer revealed. He'd say, "Give him more time. Move the commercial if you have to." That never happened with anyone else. Perhaps the deepest proof of Stewart's impact came off camera. Carson often held up Stewart's interviews as examples of perfect television, authentic moments that justified the very existence of the medium. And on the night of Carson's farewell in 1992, Stewart was one of the few people Johnny personally called to thank. A gesture that said everything about the bond between late night's most guarded host and Hollywood's most genuine star. Stewart gave Carson, and America, not just entertainment, but proof that sometimes the truest moments on television come when nobody is performing. Bob Newhart. Bob Newhart, the comic genius who made comedy look effortless. If Jimmy Stewart spoke to Carson's heart, then Bob connected straight to his comedic soul. The stand-up-turned-sitcom star shared Johnny's dry wit, razor-sharp timing, and uncanny gift for finding humor in the everyday. "He's the most effortlessly funny man I know," Carson once confided, according to a Tonight Show writer from the 70s and 80s. And from Johnny, there was no greater praise. What set Newhart apart wasn't punchlines rehearsed to perfection, it was his conversational magic. Unlike most comics who arrived armed with recycled bits, Bob came to talk, to play, and it was a style that meshed perfectly with Carson's instincts. "It was like watching 2 jazz musicians riff off each other," remembered one longtime director. Bob would start a story, Johnny would drop in the perfect comment, and Bob would build on it. They could anticipate each other's rhythm flawlessly. Carson's admiration showed in how he bent his own rules. Normally, he was strict about timing, signaling producers to cut guests short the moment segments dragged. But with Bob, Johnny did the opposite, stretching segments, waving off commercials, urging him to keep going. If Bob was on a roll, Johnny never wanted it to end, a former producer revealed. What Johnny cherished just as much was Bob's humility. Despite his enormous success, Newhart arrived without an entourage, treated crew members with kindness, and remembered the names of camera operators he hadn't seen in years. Johnny hated prima donnas, explained a producer. Bob was the opposite. Grateful, respectful, down to earth. And Johnny noticed. That respect grew into genuine friendship, rare for Carson, who fiercely guarded his private life. But when Johnny invited Bob to join him on the golf course, a privilege reserved for very few, it was proof of how much he truly valued him, not just as a guest, but as a friend. For Carson, Bob Newhart embodied the kind of comedy he most admired: quiet, intelligent, and deceptively simple. But his next favorite guest would bring something entirely different: spontaneity and unpredictability that kept Johnny on his toes. Burt Reynolds. Burt Reynolds, the ultimate partner in mischief. When Burt Reynolds showed up on The Tonight Show, viewers knew they weren't just in for another celebrity interview. They were about to watch two masters of banter go head-to-head in a playful showdown. Reynolds got it. Most guests didn't. He understands the game, Carson reportedly told a producer after one particularly hilarious appearance. At the height of his stardom in the 1970s, Burt understood something most celebrities completely missed. Talk shows weren't about plugging a project, they were about creating a moment. And Johnny loved that Reynolds never came to just promote a movie, he came to play. While other stars arrived armed with carefully scripted talking points, Burt walked in with water pistols hidden in his jacket. Their legendary prank wars became instant classics. In one unforgettable moment, Reynolds smashed a pie of shaving cream into Carson's face during what was supposed to be a serious conversation about an upcoming film. Instead of being offended, Johnny roared with laughter, harder off camera than on. Burt had done what so few could: genuinely surprise him. Johnny loved real surprise, a longtime director recalled. Not the fake, rehearsed stuff most stars do. Burt was one of the few who could actually catch him off guard. But Reynolds wasn't just a prankster. He could take a joke as well as he could throw one. Carson often poked fun at Burt's flops or his headline-making romances, and Burt laughed right along, never defensive, never thin-skinned. Johnny had a test for celebrities, revealed one producer. Could he rib them without them getting upset? Burt passed with flying colors. He loved it. Their friendship was so genuine that Carson often referenced Reynolds when coaching nervous guests. Just relax and have fun with it, like Burt Reynolds does, he'd say. Coming from Carson, that was the ultimate compliment. Reynolds embodied the playful, unpredictable energy Johnny thrived on. And while Burt brought laughter and chaos to the stage, Carson's next favorite guest would bring something completely different: a sharp, intellectual depth that revealed a side of Johnny audiences rarely got to see. Orson Welles. Orson Welles, the genius who captivated Johnny Carson. When most people think of Carson, they picture the witty, easygoing host, quick with a joke and always in command of the Tonight Show stage. But those who knew him best understood that Johnny had a far more intellectual side, one that surfaced only when certain guests came along. And no one brought it out more than Orson Welles. Johnny was fascinated by him, recalled a longtime producer. Not starstruck, like he sometimes was with Jimmy Stewart, but genuinely intrigued. Unlike other interviews, where Carson leaned on charm and banter, when Welles was scheduled, Johnny did his homework. He read about history, literature, theater, subjects he never prepared for with anyone else. With Orson, the conversations shifted away from Hollywood gossip and promo chatter into art, politics, magic, and philosophy. To viewers, it was a revelation, a Johnny Carson they rarely saw, curious, well-read, and capable of dissecting Shakespeare as effortlessly as he could crack a joke about a giraffe. One unforgettable moment came when Welles performed elaborate magic tricks live on air. The illusions stunned the crew and lit Johnny up like a child at a carnival. His face was priceless, a cameraman remembered. For those few minutes, he wasn't the host, he was just a boy at a magic show. After one trick, Carson even broke character during a commercial, turning to the audience at home. "Did you see that? That was real magic, not TV magic." What Johnny admired most wasn't just Welles's brilliance, but his honesty. Despite his legendary status, Welles spoke openly about failure, about being fired from films or having projects collapse. No Hollywood spin, no pretending every idea turned to gold. And Carson respected that deeply. He despised pretense in an industry built on it. Sometimes their conversations stretched so far beyond the Tonight Show's usual lightheartedness that they defied the format. But Johnny never cut him off, never rushed him. He relished those moments. As one of Carson's close friends recalled, "Johnny once told me, those talks with Orson are some of the most satisfying moments of my career. For a few minutes, I get to be myself, not Johnny Carson, just me." For Carson, Orson Welles represented the intellectual stimulation he secretly craved. But when he looked for something else, something that spoke to his comedic roots, it was another guest entirely who filled that space. Jack Benny. Jack Benny wasn't just a guest on The Tonight Show. He was the master who shaped Johnny Carson's very idea of comedy. The moment Benny stepped onto Carson's stage, the balance shifted. The usually composed, commanding Carson suddenly became the eager student, humbled in the presence of one of his idols. "He was the reason I do what I do," Carson once confessed to a close colleague. "Watching him was my masterclass in comedy." Benny's fingerprints were all over Carson's style. The razor-sharp timing, the subtle expressions, the way a pause or even silence could bring down the house. Those were Benny's trademarks, and Carson absorbed them like scripture. A writer from Carson's 1970s team put it plainly, Johnny's whole philosophy came from Jack. He knew a reaction could be funnier than the punchline, that silence could roar louder than words. That was pure Benny. Every time Benny appeared, Carson's admiration was obvious. His laugh came quicker, his attention sharper, his respect undeniable. Staff members recalled Carson even rearranging the set so Benny would always have the best camera angles. Johnny would actually tell the directors, "Focus on Jack, not me," remembered a producer. That just didn't happen with anyone else. Carson, the king of late night, willingly ceded the spotlight, because he knew genius when he saw it. These visits weren't just talk show moments, they were history unfolding. Benny, born in 1894, had invented radio comedy while Carson was still a boy. By the time he sat beside Johnny in the 70s, Benny was in his late 70s, yet his timing was flawless. One director put it best, it was like watching the torch pass, live on television, the old master and the new king. Carson's reverence carried off stage too. In his private office, the only framed celebrity photo wasn't of himself or the stars of his era, it was Jack Benny. That single picture spoke louder than words. For Johnny, comedy began and ended with Jack. And while Benny embodied Carson's comedy lineage, his next favorite guest offered something different but just as priceless, a warmth that turned every appearance into a reunion, not a performance. Carol Burnett. Carol Burnett, the guest who brought sunshine. Whenever Carol Burnett stepped onto the Tonight Show stage, something magical happened. Johnny Carson, the man known for his composure and control, would suddenly soften. His shoulders relaxed, his smile widened, and that invisible wall he usually kept between himself and his guests would melt away. "Carol brings sunshine to the stage," Carson once told Ed McMahon after one of her many appearances. What set Burnett apart wasn't just her comedic brilliance, it was the effortless chemistry she shared with Carson. While most interviews followed a polished, almost formal rhythm, Carol and Johnny spoke like old friends catching up after years apart. With most guests, Johnny was clearly the host and they were clearly the visitor, a longtime director explained. With Carol, it felt like two equals simply enjoying each other's company. The audience felt it too. Unlike nearly every other celebrity, Burnett was allowed to toss the script aside. She could wander into spontaneous tangents, invent silly games, or even flip the conversation and start interviewing Johnny himself. Johnny trusted Carol completely, remembered a former producer. He knew her timing was as sharp as his own, that she'd never embarrass him or the show, and that wherever she went, it would always be entertaining. That trust was rare, and it went beyond the cameras. Despite her fame from The Carol Burnett Show, she came to The Tonight Show with no airs, no entourage, no demands. She remembered the names of crew members, asked about their families, and meant it. Johnny noticed, and valued it deeply. The affection between them showed in the way Carson broke his own rules. Normally, he was strict about time. But when Carol was in the middle of a great story, he'd wave off the producer's wrap-up signals, sometimes even bumping other guests just to give her more airtime. That kind of treatment was almost unheard of. And even when she wasn't on stage, she was still in the room. Staff members recalled how Carson would often bring up Burnett's past appearances when preparing for other guests, using her as the gold standard for how to shine on late-night television. Carol Burnett gave Johnny Carson more than laughs. She gave him comfort, camaraderie, and a spark of spontaneity that he treasured. James Garner. the movie star who felt like a neighbor. When James Garner sank into the Tonight Show couch, it wasn't the usual Hollywood spectacle. It felt more like listening in on two old friends swapping stories. No scripts, no pretense, just genuine conversation. After one such visit, Johnny Carson leaned over to a producer and quipped, "He's what a movie star should be, and most aren't." What Carson admired most about Garner was his authenticity. In an industry full of men who never stopped performing, James was refreshingly unpolished. A longtime talent coordinator recalled, "Johnny could spot a phony a mile away." James was the opposite. What you saw was exactly what you got, whether the cameras were rolling or not. Garner's stories carried a grounded, human quality. When he talked about The Great Escape or his time on Maverick, he didn't glorify himself. Instead, he recounted the practical jokes, the friendships, and even the blunders, the kind of details that painted Hollywood not as a temple of gods, but as just another workplace. As one Tonight Show writer put it, James talked about being a movie star the way most people talk about their 9-to-5. His anecdotes about Steve McQueen's temper sounded less like celebrity gossip and more like the way you describe a difficult coworker, with a mix of affection, exasperation, and not a shred of reverence. That humility wasn't just for show. Off camera, Garner arrived without the circus of an entourage, greeted crew members by name, and treated pages and producers with equal respect. A veteran producer revealed that Johnny noticed such things more than anyone realized. He paid close attention to how guests treated the staff when they thought no one important was watching. James passed that test every time. What set Garner apart among Carson's favorites was his rare ability to bridge eras. He could spin stories about Brando or Julie Andrews that fascinated older viewers, while his natural, modern sensibility kept younger audiences hooked. He never name-dropped, never strutted, he simply shared. That balance made him timeless. Most telling of all, Carson, who usually kept a careful wall between his public and private life, would occasionally allude to off-air conversations with Garner. It was a subtle sign of true friendship. For Johnny, James wasn't just another star. He was proof that realness could still shine in Hollywood. And while Garner embodied the unpretentious authenticity Carson cherished, his next favorite guest offered something different but equally invaluable, a living link to comedy's golden age. George Burns, the legend who kept getting better. When George Burns walked onto the Tonight Show stage in his later years, it wasn't just another guest spot, it was a moment of reverence. Johnny Carson, television's unshakable king, treated him with the kind of deference usually reserved for royalty. At 80, 90, and eventually past 100, Burns wasn't just a comedian. He was living history, the last great link to vaudeville, the tradition that had shaped Carson's own comedic DNA. Johnny would actually get nervous before George's appearances, a producer once revealed. Not because the show might stumble, but because Carson held such profound respect for Burns's place in comedy's pantheon. It was, he said, like watching a concert pianist prepare to perform for Mozart. What set Burns apart was how he defied age. While most performers recycled old material, George kept evolving. Even in his 90s, he brought fresh jokes, sharp timing, and a wit that felt timeless. George was the only guy in Hollywood who got funnier as he got older, recalled one of Carson's writers. Most of us peak and hang on. George just kept climbing. Carson's admiration showed in the way he conducted the interviews. Normally the master puppeteer, guiding conversations with precision, Johnny gave George the stage. He'd ask a question, then lean back, sometimes sitting silent for minutes as Burns delivered gold. For a host known for jumping in every 30 seconds, that silence spoke louder than words. Burns himself noticed the difference. In his autobiography he wrote, "If Johnny Carson likes you, you're bulletproof in this business. And for some reason, Johnny always liked me." The reason was clear to anyone who knew Carson well. George embodied everything Johnny valued: professionalism, perfect timing, and the ability to make something incredibly hard look effortless. Even off-camera, Carson couldn't hide his respect. During commercial breaks, when he normally huddled with producers, he stayed locked in with George, asking about vaudeville greats from the 1920s and 30s, hungry for every scrap of wisdom. Johnny was getting a private masterclass in comedy history, recalled a camera operator. And he treasured every second of it. George Burns connected Carson to comedy's roots. But Carson's final favorite guest would represent something just as powerful: the rise of women in comedy, pioneers whose breakthroughs ran parallel to Carson's own innovations in television. Lucille Ball. Lucille Ball wasn't just a star, she was television royalty. And when she walked onto the Tonight Show stage, audiences got to witness something rare. Two titans of television sharing a spotlight, each having forever reshaped the medium. Johnny Carson had redefined late-night entertainment, but decades earlier, Lucy had rewritten the rules of the sitcom. On his 10th anniversary special, Carson broke from his usual reserve, telling viewers with unmistakable sincerity, "She's royalty." What made those moments unforgettable wasn't only Lucy's razor-sharp comedic timing, which never dulled with age. It was the bond between two performers who understood the weight of carrying a show, night after night, year after year, with millions watching. A producer who had worked with both later admitted, they knew the pressure better than anyone else. That's why their connection was so genuine. Carson, normally the unshakable center of The Tonight Show, would openly defer to her. He gave her the best angles, laughed from the gut at her jokes, and showed her a warmth that went beyond mere courtesy. One director remembered Johnny instructing the camera crew, "Make sure you catch her reactions, not just mine." That was unheard of. Perhaps the most touching exchange came in 1973, when Carson surprised Lucy with footage from her very first screen test, a reel she hadn't seen in decades. She teared up, just briefly, before deflecting with her trademark wit. A Tonight Show writer later said, "That moment revealed everything. Johnny knew exactly how to touch her heart without exploiting it. And Lucy trusted him enough to show real emotion." Carson admired her for more than comedy. He respected her as a trailblazing businesswoman, the first woman to run a major television studio, long before Hollywood thought women belonged in those rooms. "Lucy isn't just the funniest woman," Carson once confided to a friend. "She's the smartest person in television. Period." That respect shaped how he treated her. When Lucy was on, time limits evaporated. Segments stretched, other guests got bumped, and producer signals to wrap up were waved off if she was mid-story. No one else got that kind of treatment. Even when she wasn't there, Carson invoked her name. To staff, to guests, to friends, Lucy was the gold standard. She embodied everything Johnny valued, one longtime producer explained. Talent without ego. Success without arrogance. And the wisdom to know that television wasn't just entertainment. It was both an art and a business. And she mastered both.